She stood at the bottom of the staircase and listened to the laughter coming from upstairs. It wasn't her daughter laughing. It wasn't her grandchildren. It was a woman she had never met. Sleeping in her bed, wearing her robe, calling herself the lady of the house. And every single person in that family knew she was there. Every single one of them had decided not to tell her. What none of them realized, not the husband, not his mother, not his brothers, was that the house they were all standing in belonged to her. The cars in the driveway, the business accounts, the land the house sat on, every deed, every title, every contract, her name, not his. And on the morning they asked her to leave her own home, she made one phone call. That phone call would cost them everything. This is the story of Vivienne Caldwell, the woman her husband tried to erase, and the extraordinary moment she decided she was done being quiet. You are about to hear one of the most quietly devastating stories of betrayal this channel has ever covered. And what makes it different from every other story about a woman who was cheated on and discarded is this one simple fact. The man who tried to replace her had no idea what was waiting inside the filing cabinet at the end of the hall. He had no idea that the house he was living in, the business he was running, the vehicles he drove to his other woman's apartment, none of it was legally his. Not a single piece of it. He had been a guest in his own marriage for 22 years and never once realized it. And when the moment finally came, when his family stood on that porch and told Vivienne Caldwell she needed to find somewhere else to go, she did not cry. She did not scream. She walked back upstairs, past the woman in her bedroom, past the laughter she was no longer welcome to interrupt, and she sat down at her desk. She opened the bottom drawer, and she began to count. Before we go any further, we need to understand who Vivienne was before any of this happened. Because this story does not begin with betrayal. It begins with a little girl sitting at a kitchen table in Raleigh, North Carolina, learning how to balance a checkbook at the age of 12. Vivienne Marie Caldwell was born in 1964, the eldest of 4 children in a working-class family outside Raleigh. Her father drove a delivery truck. Her mother cleaned houses for families who lived on the other side of town. There was not always enough, but there was always enough to count. And Vivienne learned to count every dollar that came into that house before she was old enough to stay up past 9 o'clock. Her mother used to say that Vivienne was born understanding that money was a language. And if you didn't learn to speak it fluently, somebody else would always translate for you, and rarely in your favor. By the time Vivienne was 16, she was not just managing her family's grocery list. She was reconciling her parents' bank statements, tracking late fees, and quietly negotiating payment plans with the utility company when the bills ran high in winter. She never announced this. She never asked for credit. She simply sat at that kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a calculator her mother had found at a garage sale for 75 cents, and she made the numbers work. That was Vivienne Caldwell at 16. Quiet, methodical, entirely in control of what she could reach. She graduated high school a year early. She enrolled in community college while working evenings at a pharmacy. By 26, she had her accounting certificate. By 28, she was managing the books for 3 small businesses in her county. She saved money the way other people saved secrets. Carefully, consistently, and without telling anyone who didn't need to know. By 1991, she had $34,000 in a personal savings account. She had worked for every single dollar of it. She had never once depended on anyone else to put it there. And that is what you need to hold on to as the story unfolds. Because that discipline, that particular unglamorous, quiet kind of financial discipline, is the thing that will matter most at the very end. In the summer of 1991, Vivienne attended a church picnic in Durham with her younger sister, Renee. She had not planned to meet anyone that afternoon. She had worn sensible shoes. But across the lawn, standing in a group of men laughing loudly at something she couldn't hear, was Gerald Caldwell. Gerald was 30 years old, and he moved through a room the way men move through a room when they have never once doubted that they belonged in it. He had a wide, easy smile. He was tall. He coached youth baseball on Saturday mornings and called elderly women at the church ma'am without being told to. Vivienne's sister Renee saw him first and leaned over and said, "That man is trouble in a good suit." Vivienne said, "He's not wearing a suit." Renee said, "I know what I said." Gerald made his way over before the afternoon was out. He asked Vivienne about herself, and he actually listened when she answered, which in her experience was rarer than most people admitted. He sold insurance. He was building his own territory. He had ambitions he talked about with a kind of forward momentum that felt, in those early hours, like confidence rather than noise. Vivienne thought about him on the drive home. She thought about him for 3 days after that. That was not something Vivienne Caldwell did. She was not a woman who spent 3 days thinking about a man. But Gerald was different enough from the men she had dated before to keep her attention. He was present. He was warm. He laughed easily and without cruelty. And he had called her mother ma'am the first time they met, which her mother mentioned twice on the phone the following week. They dated for 2 years. Gerald proposed in the winter of 1993 on a Tuesday evening in her apartment kitchen while Vivienne was making dinner. He came in from the cold. He got down on one knee on her tile floor, and he held up a ring he had been making payments on for 6 months at a jewelry store on Franklin Street. Vivienne turned the stove off. She looked at him for a moment, just one moment, and she said yes before he finished the sentence. They married that June in a ceremony that her mother called the most beautiful afternoon of her life. And in those early years, that was exactly what it was. They moved into a rented house in Cary, North Carolina, in the summer of 1993. Vivienne kept her position at the accounting firm. Gerald expanded his insurance territory. They were not rich, but they were building something, and for a while, that feeling of building together was enough to make everything else feel secondary. Their son, Marcus, was born in 1995. He had Gerald's smile and Vivienne's eyes and a way of looking at you directly when he spoke that made both of them feel seen in a way that nothing else ever quite did. They tried for more children. After the first miscarriage, Vivienne went quiet for a week and Gerald brought her flowers and held her without needing her to explain anything. After the second miscarriage, the flowers came again, but the silence between them stretched a little longer. After the third, Vivienne stopped talking about it out loud. She kept the grief inside, the way she had always kept things she couldn't balance. Filed away where she could access it without letting it unsettle the rest. Gerald said the right things. He was there in the ways he knew how to be there. But there was something Vivienne was beginning to understand about Gerald Caldwell in those middle years of their marriage. He was magnificent at ease and absent in the presence of difficulty. Not cruel. Not indifferent. Simply gone from himself when things required more than charm could offer. He would stand in a room full of people and make every one of them feel that he was the most interesting conversation they had ever had. He would come home to something hard. A hard bill, a hard silence, a hard question that had no easy answer, and something in him would step back just slightly. Not enough to be called neglect. Just enough to leave more room for Vivienne. And Vivienne filled the room. Because that was what she did. That was what she had always done. The financial division of their household began innocently enough. Vivienne handled the money because she was better at it. Gerald handled the social world they moved in because he was better at that. He charmed the neighbors. She reconciled the accounts. He made friends at every party. She made sure the mortgage cleared before the grace period ended. Nobody called it a problem. Nobody called it anything. It was simply the way things worked in the Caldwell household, and it worked for a long time. What nobody discussed, including Vivienne, was the slow accumulation of invisible labor that arrangement created. When they bought their first home in Cary, Vivienne's income qualified the mortgage. Her credit score was what the bank needed to approve the loan. Gerald's name was on the paperwork too, but in the margins, functionally. The weight of it was hers. She managed the property taxes. She managed the homeowner's insurance. She tracked the escrow account. Gerald said she was the smartest woman he had ever met, and he meant it completely, which is partly why it never occurred to him to wonder what being the smartest person in the household cost her. In 1999, they enrolled Marcus in a private elementary school. The tuition came out of the household budget that Vivienne managed. In 2001, they bought a larger home, a 4-bedroom colonial in a suburb of Charlotte that Gerald had picked out from a real estate listing and shown to Vivienne over breakfast one Sunday morning with the enthusiasm of a man who had already decided. He loved the house. He talked about the yard and the school district and the neighborhood and the way the kitchen opened into the living room. Vivienne looked at the numbers. The mortgage was manageable on their combined income. Barely in the early years. When they signed the closing documents, Gerald's income from his insurance sales was inconsistent enough that the loan officer had recommended keeping the primary borrower as one party. Vivienne signed. Gerald initialed where directed. The deed was recorded in the county courthouse in the name of Vivienne Marie Caldwell. Gerald drove home from the closing and told his brother Raymond that they had bought the most beautiful house in the neighborhood. And he was right. It was beautiful, but it belonged to his wife. And in the excitement of the move and the unpacking and the new neighborhood and Marcus's new school, this was never a conversation they had. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. In 2004, Gerald's insurance territory was absorbed into a regional company after a corporate restructuring. What that meant in plain language was that Gerald Caldwell was out of a job. He did not tell Vivienne immediately. He drove to the office 2 days after the meeting and sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes before he came home and told her over dinner. She remembers the exact way he looked at the table when he said it. She remembers that she reached across and put her hand on his and said, "We will be fine." And they were fine, because Vivienne made them fine. For 18 months, she absorbed the shortfall. She moved money from savings. She managed the timing of every bill with a precision that nobody on the outside would ever have seen. Gerald began job searching. He was not a man who liked being dependent, and the discomfort of those 18 months lived in him like an itch he couldn't locate. He was harder to reach during that time, more likely to be at a friend's house than at home. Vivienne understood it, or she told herself she did. She told herself that men like Gerald needed space to reassemble their sense of themselves when something like that happened. She gave him the space. She continued paying the bills. In 2005, Gerald found a new sales position. Smaller territory, lower commission, but steady. He came home the evening he signed the contract and took Vivienne out to dinner at the nicest restaurant in Charlotte and told her she had saved them. She smiled and said it was what you do. She meant it. That was the thing about Vivienne that nobody in the Caldwell family ever fully understood. She was not performing sacrifice. She was not keeping score. She loved that man the way some people love things they have built with their own hands. Completely, without condition, and without ever thinking to ask what would happen if the thing she built decided one day it no longer wanted to belong to her. In 2007, a former client approached Vivienne at a professional association meeting. His name was Leonard Park. He owned a small commercial property in South Charlotte, a 2-unit building in a neighborhood that was beginning to see new restaurants and foot traffic and the early, tentative signs of revitalization. Leonard needed to sell. He was relocating to Atlanta for his wife's job transfer. He offered Vivienne the property at a price that she recognized, with her 15 years of accounting experience, was considerably below what that location would be worth in 5 years. She went home that evening and ran the numbers for 3 hours at her kitchen table. She called her attorney. She called her accountant. She did not call Gerald. Not because she was hiding it, but because she had been managing financial decisions in this household for 14 years and had never once been asked for her input on the decision itself, only for her signature on the paperwork after the decision was made. The money was hers. The analysis was hers. The risk was hers. She bought the property the following month using funds from her personal savings account, the one she had maintained since before she was married, the one she had built from the pharmacy job and the accounting certificate and the careful, meticulous work of 15 years. Leonard Park signed over the deed. It was recorded in the county courthouse in the name of Vivienne Marie Caldwell. She told Gerald over dinner the following week. He looked up from his plate and said, "That sounds like a smart investment, Viv." Then he asked if she wanted to see a basketball game on Saturday. She said sure. And that was the entire conversation. The commercial property would appreciate steadily over the next 8 years. By 2015, the neighborhood around it had fully transformed. The 2-unit building that Leonard Park had sold to Vivienne for a price that reflected his urgency and not the market's potential was now worth 4 times what she had paid for it. The rent from the 2 tenants, a boutique and a small law firm, was deposited monthly into an account that only Vivienne controlled. Gerald received a portion of those funds as part of the household budget. He received it the way he received every financial resource in the Caldwell household, as something that was simply there, that his wife managed, that required no particular attention from him. There are people reading this right now who are already putting the pieces together. There are people who understand exactly where this is going. Hold that thought, because it is going exactly where you think it is. In 2009, the financial crisis hit the Caldwell household the way it hit millions of American families. Sideways, without warning, and harder than expected. Gerald's sales commissions collapsed. His territory was restructured again. By the spring of 2010, their household was running on Vivienne's salary from the accounting firm, the rental income from the commercial property, and the carefully depleted reserves of the savings account. Vivienne called her insurance company and restructured their health plan. She deferred the exterior painting on the house by 1 season. She moved Marcus's college fund contributions to a temporary minimum. And she said nothing to Gerald's family about any of it. She protected his dignity the way she had always protected it, entirely and without acknowledgement. The Caldwell family continued to arrive at Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter and sit at her table and eat the meals she prepared and tell Gerald how well he was doing. Vivienne smiled and passed the rolls. In 2011, Gerald announced that he wanted to start his own insurance consulting firm. He had a business plan. He had the name. He had cards printed. What he did not have was a credit history strong enough to secure a business line of credit on his own. His personal score had taken damage from the 2008 and 2009 struggles that Vivienne had absorbed without his full awareness of how close to the edge they had been. Gerald went to the bank. The bank told him the numbers didn't support an independent loan. He came home and sat at the kitchen table and looked the way he had looked in 2004 when he lost his territory. Vivienne said, "What do you need?" He said, "My credit isn't strong enough for the business loan." She said, "I'll co-sign." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You don't have to do that." She said, "I know." The following week, Vivienne sat across from the loan officer and co-signed her name to the business credit line. The founding documents listed her as a co-signatory with a documented financial interest in the company. Gerald named the business, designed the logo, and hired a part-time assistant. Vivienne went back to her office and continued managing the accounts of 7 other businesses that were not hers. The consulting firm did well. Not extraordinarily well, but steadily. By 2013, it had a small but reliable client base, and Gerald had reclaimed the quiet confidence that Vivienne had always loved about him. He was good with clients. He was charming and trustworthy in the way that insurance professionals need to be to build a book of business. He was, in those years, a genuinely good provider, not the primary one, but a real one. And Vivienne, watching him rebuild himself, felt something she recognized as love in its most private form. The kind that doesn't need to be said. The kind that simply exists in the daily architecture of a life shared. She did not know, in the spring of 2013 when Marcus left for college in Atlanta and she and Gerald sat on the porch and watched his car disappear around the corner, that the architecture was already cracking. She could not see it yet, but it was there. The first sign was small enough to explain away. Gerald began attending more networking events in the evenings. This was reasonable. His consulting practice ran on relationships, and relationships required cultivation. Vivienne understood this. She had built enough of her own professional relationships over the years to understand the language of a calendar filling up. The second sign was his phone. He had always left it on the kitchen counter when he came home. In the spring of 2014, the phone began accompanying him to rooms he used to enter without it. He took it to the bathroom. He turned it face down on the nightstand. He would glance at it during dinner in a way that he clearly believed was invisible. It was not invisible. Vivienne saw every single thing Gerald Caldwell did in their shared space. She had spent 22 years paying close attention to the details of their life together. Noticing was not something she did occasionally. It was something she did the way other people breathed. She noticed the phone. She noticed the evenings. She noticed the way he was slightly more careful around her, careful in the way people are careful when they are carrying something they don't want to spill. She told herself she was imagining it. She told herself the stress of the empty house was making her read into things that weren't there. She told herself, in the particular voice that women use when they are protecting something they are not yet ready to grieve, that her marriage was not that. She was wrong. In the spring of 2014, Gerald sat her down at the kitchen table. He was wearing the gray sweater she had given him 2 Christmases ago, and he had his hands folded in front of him, which she recognized as the posture of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say. He told her he had been feeling disconnected. He told her the empty nest had made him evaluate his life in ways he hadn't expected. He used phrases like finding himself, and space to breathe, and needing to figure some things out. Vivienne sat across from him and listened without interrupting. She had listened carefully for 22 years. She knew how to sit still inside a difficult conversation. When he finished, she asked him one question. She said, "Gerald, is there someone else?" He looked at his folded hands. Then he looked at her. He said, "No." She looked at him for a long moment, long enough to see what was in his face. Then she said, "What are you asking for?" He said he needed a trial separation. He said he needed to sleep in the guest room for a while. He said he thought if they had some space from each other, they might be able to figure out what they had lost. Vivienne did not throw anything. She did not raise her voice. She said, "All right," and she went to bed. That night, lying in the room they had shared for over a decade, Vivienne Caldwell thought about the first time she saw Gerald across a lawn at a church picnic in Durham. She thought about his folded hands on that kitchen table. She thought about the way he had said no to her question while looking at those hands. She already knew. She had known before she asked. But knowing and saying are 2 different things, and Vivienne was not yet ready for the thing that came after saying. So she lay in the dark and she let herself have one last night of not saying it. And then the morning came and she got up and she went to work. The separation, if you could call it that, given that they were both still living in the same house, lasted 14 months. Gerald slept in the guest room. He came and went at irregular hours. He began spending entire weekends away. He told Vivienne he was staying with his brother Raymond when he was out of town for work. Later, Vivienne would learn that Raymond had not seen Gerald on any of those weekends. He had been with her. Her name was Donna Reeves. She was 34 years old. She worked at the front desk of a golf club on the east side of Charlotte where Gerald had become a regular member in 2013. She was blonde and thin and wore her hair in a ponytail and was, by every account of people who knew her from the club, perfectly pleasant in the way that people are pleasant when they are not yet the villain of anyone's story. Donna did not know, in those early months, that Gerald Caldwell was married. Or rather, she knew he had a wife. But Gerald had explained the situation in the way that men in his position explain their situations. He told her the marriage was over in every way that mattered. He told her he and Vivienne had an understanding. He told her he was only staying in the house to work out the logistics. These things were false. But Donna Reeves was 34 and Gerald Caldwell was charming, and she believed him the way people believe things when they want very much for them to be true. The question Vivienne did not know she needed to ask, through all those 14 months, was a very simple one. "What are you planning, Gerald?" Because Gerald was planning something. He just hadn't told anyone, including Donna, the full dimensions of what he had in mind. By the late summer of 2015, Gerald had apparently decided that the arrangement he had been managing, the weekend disappearances, the guest bedroom, the ongoing presence of Vivienne in the house he had come to think of as his, was no longer sustainable. He told his mother, Patricia Caldwell, that the marriage was definitively over. He told his brother Raymond that he had moved on. He told his cousin Bet that Vivienne was handling it well, which was a sentence that meant absolutely nothing and was designed to mean nothing, and which the Caldwell family accepted without a single follow-up question. And then, on a Friday evening in October of 2015, Gerald Caldwell drove to the golf club and picked up Donna Reeves and her 2 suitcases and a small terrier named Biscuit, and he drove them back to the house on Haverford Lane in Charlotte, North Carolina. The house that he called his. The house that, in every legal sense that exists, was not. He pulled into the driveway at 6:47 in the evening. Vivienne's car was in the garage where it always was. The lights were on in the kitchen the way they always were because Vivienne came home from work and turned on the lights in the kitchen first, the way she had done for 22 years. Gerald knew she was home. He brought Donna inside anyway. Vivienne was at the stove. She heard the front door. She heard the dog. She heard Gerald's voice and then a voice she did not recognize. She turned around. A woman she had never seen in her life was standing in her kitchen in a light blue jacket with a suitcase handle in each hand and a small dog at her feet. The woman looked at Vivienne. She smiled the smile of someone who had been told this would be awkward but manageable. She said, "Hi, I'm Donna." Vivienne looked at Donna. Then she looked at Gerald. Gerald was looking at the floor. The same floor. The same posture. The same absolute refusal to meet her eyes that he had shown her at the kitchen table 14 months ago when she asked him if there was someone else. There was a silence in that kitchen that lasted approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a very long time when it is the silence at the end of 22 years. Vivienne turned back to the stove. She turned the burner off. She set the spoon down on the rest beside the pot. She said nothing. She walked past Gerald and past Donna and past the dog and past the suitcases. She walked upstairs. She walked to the end of the hall. She opened the door of her home office. She sat down at her desk. And she thought about what she was going to do. What she did not do is the part of this story that separates Vivienne Caldwell from every easier version of this moment. She did not call her sister and cry. She did not call the police. She did not go back downstairs and say the things that would have been completely understandable to say. She sat at her desk. She opened her laptop. She pulled up the county property records website. She typed in her address. The result came back in seconds. Owner of record, Vivienne Marie Caldwell. She already knew this, of course. She had always known this. But seeing it on the screen in that moment, with Donna Reeves 2 floors below her making herself at home in a kitchen Vivienne had cooked in every day for 14 years. Seeing it on the screen made something settle in her chest. Something very quiet, very cold, very certain. She picked up her phone. She called her attorney. His name was Howard Briggs, and he had been her attorney for 11 years, retained personally with her own money, for her own legal matters, entirely separate from anything Gerald had ever been involved in. Howard answered on the second ring. Vivienne said, "Howard. He's brought a woman into my house." Howard was quiet for a moment. He said, "Are you safe?" She said, "I am completely safe. I need you to do something for me on Monday morning." Howard said, "Tell me." She said, "I want you to send Gerald Caldwell a certified letter. I want it to inform him that the property at this address is titled solely in my name, and that he has 30 days to vacate." Howard said, "Vivienne." She said, "Howard." Howard said, "I'll have it ready by Monday morning." She said, "Thank you." She hung up. She sat in her office for another 40 minutes. Then she went to bed. She slept better than she had slept in 14 months. There are things you need to understand about what was waiting inside that filing cabinet in Vivienne's home office. Because this is where the story shifts from the story of a woman being wronged to the story of something much more extraordinary. Vivienne had spent 30 years building and maintaining the kind of financial documentation that most people never bother with. Every account statement filed by year going back to 1990. Every mortgage document, every refinancing agreement, every property tax record. Every business contract she had ever co-signed. Every deed. Every insurance policy. Every investment account. She had files for things Gerald didn't even know existed. Not because she was hiding them, because she was the one who filed things. She had always been the one who filed things. Let us go through what those files contained. The house on Haverford Lane, the 4-bedroom colonial that Gerald called his house at every family gathering and dinner party and neighborhood barbecue for 14 years, was titled solely in the name of Vivienne Marie Caldwell. When they had refinanced the mortgage in 2008, Gerald's credit had deteriorated enough from the economic pressures of that period that the loan officer had recommended proceeding with Vivienne as the sole borrower. Gerald had initialed the documents where directed and never read the language carefully enough to understand what that meant for the deed. He had been living in her house for 7 years without knowing it. The commercial property in South Charlotte, the one Vivienne had purchased in 2007 from Leonard Park using her personal savings, was titled solely in her name and had a current estimated market value of approximately $680,000. Gerald had never contributed a dollar to its purchase or upkeep. He had never been listed on its deed. He received a portion of its rental income through the household budget without ever asking where that money came from. The rental income, deposited monthly into an account bearing only her name, had been accumulating interest for 8 years. Gerald's consulting business, the one that bore his name and that he had built client by client over 4 years, had Vivienne's name on its founding documents as a co-signatory with a documented financial interest. Her credit had made the business line of credit possible. Without her co-signature, the bank had already told Gerald no. That co-signature, under the business credit law of the state of North Carolina, gave Vivienne a legal ownership interest in the entity. Howard Briggs, reviewing the documents on a Saturday afternoon while Gerald was downstairs introducing Donna to the neighborhood on a walk, would later tell Vivienne that she was arguably the most financially powerful person in that household, and that not one person who lived or operated within it had the faintest idea, including Gerald, especially Gerald. The certified letter was sent on Monday morning, October 19, 2015. Gerald signed for it at the front door in a bathrobe at 9:14 in the morning. Donna was in the kitchen. He opened the envelope at the kitchen table. He read the first paragraph. Then he read it again. The letter was 4 paragraphs long. He read all 4 of them twice. Then he sat at Vivienne's kitchen table in Vivienne's kitchen in Vivienne's house with the letter in his hands, and he did not move for approximately 5 minutes. The letter stated, in the measured, unambiguous language of Howard Briggs, that the property at the address where Gerald was currently residing was titled solely in the name of Vivienne Marie Caldwell. It stated that as a non-titled occupant with no executed tenancy agreement, Gerald Caldwell had no legal right to remain on the premises. It requested that he and all additional non-titled occupants, and it did not say Donna by name, but the phrasing left no room for confusion, vacate the property within 30 days. It further requested that all personal property belonging to non-titled occupants be removed during that window or would be subject to legal disposal. It also noted, in the 4th paragraph, that given Vivienne's documented co-signatory status and financial interest in his consulting business, her attorney would be in contact with his regarding a formal review of that arrangement. Gerald put the letter on the table. He looked at the ceiling. Then he picked up his phone and called his brother Raymond. Raymond Caldwell was 46 years old, a project manager in the construction industry, and a man who prided himself on being practical. When Gerald called, Raymond listened to a summary of the letter and said, "What does that mean exactly?" Gerald said, "It means she's saying the house is hers." Raymond said, "That doesn't make any sense. You've lived there for 14 years. Gerald said, "I know, but she's saying it's in her name." Raymond said, "That can't be right." Gerald said, "I need you to call a lawyer." Raymond called a real estate attorney he knew from a previous construction project. He read the letter to him over the phone. The attorney was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Raymond, who signed the closing documents on that house?" Raymond said he didn't know. The attorney said, "Find out." Raymond called Gerald back. Gerald, who had by that point spent 2 hours on the phone with 2 different attorneys, said very quietly, "Vivienne signed." Raymond was quiet. He said, "What about the refinance?" Gerald said, "Vivienne signed." Raymond said, "Gerald." Gerald said, "I know." There was a long silence on the phone. Raymond Caldwell, who had stood on Vivienne's porch less than 48 hours earlier and told her gently that the family had talked it over and everyone agreed it was time for her to relocate. Raymond Caldwell said nothing for approximately 30 seconds. Then he said, "What are you going to do?" Gerald said, "I have to talk to her." Before that conversation happened, something else happened first. Something that would matter for the rest of this story. Gerald called his mother. Patricia Caldwell was 67 years old. She was a woman who had always spoken plainly and loved her son deeply and operated on the assumption that those two things were compatible. She had been the one who called Vivienne on that first Saturday morning and told her, gently and with a certain firmness, that perhaps it was time to find her own place. She had coordinated with Raymond. She had talked to Cousin Bet. She had done what she did when her family needed organizing. She organized. When Gerald explained the situation to her, Patricia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet. Then she said, "So the house is hers?" Gerald said, "Yes." Patricia said, "The commercial property is hers?" Gerald said, "Yes." Patricia said, "And your business?" Gerald said, "Her name is on the founding documents. Howard Briggs says she has a legal financial interest." Patricia said nothing for a very long time. Gerald said, "Mom," she said. "I called her and told her to leave her own home." The words sat between them on the phone line. Gerald did not respond. Patricia said, "We all did." Gerald said, "I know." Patricia said, "Gerald, what have you done?" It was not a question. Gerald knocked on the door of Vivienne's home office on a Wednesday evening, 3 days after the letter arrived. Vivienne told him to come in. He sat in the small chair across from her desk. He looked, for the first time in a very long time, like a man who was not entirely sure he belonged in the room he was sitting in. He told her he had not understood. About the deed. About the property. He said he'd had no idea how the documents were structured. Vivienne looked at him without expression. She said, "You knew you didn't sign anything, Gerald." He said, "I trusted you to handle it." She said, "I know you did." He asked if this was about revenge. She said, "No." He said, "Then what is it about?" She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Your family called me on a Saturday morning and told me to leave my own home. You brought a woman into this house with 2 suitcases and a dog without a single conversation. You looked at the floor when I asked you if there was someone else. In the kitchen. The same kitchen I have cooked in every day for 14 years. You looked at the floor." She said, "I am doing what I am doing because I am finally paying attention to what has always been true. I am not doing this to hurt you. I am doing this because no one, not you, not your mother, not your brother, ever once stopped to ask a single question that should have been obvious." He said, "What question?" She said, "Whose name is on the deed?" He looked at the desk. She said, "You have 30 days, Gerald. I suggest you use them." He sat in that chair for another minute. Then he stood up and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. Without turning around, he said, "I did love you, Vivienne." She said, "I know. I loved you too." She paused. Then she said, "That's what makes all of this so simple." He walked out. She turned back to her desk. She had a property review at 2 o'clock the next afternoon and a client call at 4. She had, as she had always had, a great deal to manage. Gerald and Donna moved out on the 28th day. They rented an apartment across the city. Donna's name was on the lease because Gerald's financial situation, now being formally reviewed by Howard Briggs, made him a less attractive tenant to a landlord who ran credit checks. It was the first apartment that Gerald Caldwell had ever rented in his adult life where his name was not the primary name on anything. He paid his portion of the utilities with a check that cleared on time because Vivienne, out of a habit so deep it operated without her permission, had ensured there was enough in the joint account to cover his incidentals through the transition. She caught herself doing it and stopped. Then she closed the joint account. The legal review of Gerald's business took 6 months. Howard Briggs was meticulous and methodical, which is the thing you want in an attorney and the thing that makes opposing attorneys very tired. Vivienne did not seek to destroy the business. She was not interested in scorched earth. She was interested in an accounting. After reviewing every founding document, every loan record, every month of the business credit line that her co-signature had made possible, Howard arrived at a figure that represented Vivienne's documented financial interest in the company. The settlement was confidential. What is known is that Gerald Caldwell paid it. Took him 2 years. During those 2 years, he operated his consulting business on a tighter margin than he had ever managed before, because for the first time in his professional life, there was no one sitting at a kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night making the numbers work. He had to make the numbers work himself. He was slower at it than she was. But he learned. The house on Haverford Lane sold in the spring of 2016. Not because Vivienne had to sell it. She had every legal right to remain in it for as long as she chose. She sold it because she no longer wanted it. She had painted the front porch of that house white every spring for 14 years. She had replaced the kitchen faucet herself on a February afternoon when Gerald was at a conference and the plumber couldn't come until Tuesday. She had stood at the stove in that kitchen on the evening that Gerald walked in with a strange woman and 2 suitcases and a dog, and she had set down her spoon and walked quietly upstairs. She did not want to cook in that kitchen anymore. She did not want to paint that porch. She put the house on the market and it sold in 17 days to a family from Ohio who were relocating for the husband's job. She did not attend the closing. Howard Briggs handled it. She was in Asheville that week, looking at a property that a real estate agent she trusted had called her about 3 weeks earlier. It was a smaller house, 3 bedrooms, a big front porch facing west. The mountain view from that porch was, the agent told her, something you had to see in person to fully understand. She saw it in person. She understood immediately. She bought it without showing it to anyone first. The Caldwell family, in the months after the certified letter and the move-out and the settlement proceedings, underwent the particular rearrangement that happens to families when the person who held the center quietly removes herself from the middle. Patricia Caldwell sent a letter of apology 6 months after Donna and Gerald moved out. It was long. It was specific. It named the phone call she had made on that Saturday morning and the language she had used and the assumption she had operated under. Patricia Caldwell was not a woman who apologized lightly. The letter was genuine. Vivienne read it twice. She kept it in the filing cabinet at the end of the hall, the same one that had held the documents that changed everything. She did not respond, not out of cruelty, but because some apologies arrive too late to be answered and can only be received. Raymond Caldwell, who had come to the porch with his careful voice and his family consensus, ran into Vivienne at a grocery store in Charlotte approximately 8 months after she had moved out. He was in the produce section. He saw her across the aisle and started to move toward her. He began to say her name. Vivienne smiled at him. A full, genuine smile. The kind she had always given him at Christmas and Thanksgiving and every Easter dinner she had ever hosted. And she kept walking. It was, by every measure, the correct response to the correct amount of distance. Cousin Bet, who had sent the text message about the apartment complex, the helpful, cheerful, utterly presumptuous text message suggesting a nice place on the other side of Charlotte, had deleted Vivienne's number from her phone the day the certified letter became widely known within the family. Bet has never publicly explained why she thought that would help anything. It did not help anything. What it did was confirm that Bet had never quite understood what kind of woman Vivienne Caldwell was. Gerald and Donna stayed together for 14 months after moving into the apartment. By that accounting, the relationship survived exactly as long as it needed to survive before it didn't. The particulars of their separation were never made public. What is known is that Donna Reeves was a perfectly ordinary person who had been sold a story about a marriage that was already over, who had walked into a situation she did not fully understand, and who eventually found herself sitting across from a man in a 2-bedroom apartment in Charlotte who was quieter and more financially stressed than he had ever been, and who had, over the course of that year, lost the lightness that had always been his most magnetic quality. People are different when they have to do things themselves. Gerald Caldwell was different when he had to do things himself. Donna left in January of 2017. She moved back to her apartment, which she had kept, which was in her name, which she had signed for herself. This, Vivienne would later observe to her sister Renee over the phone, was the smartest thing Donna Reeves ever did. Renee said, "Viv, are you defending the woman?" Vivienne said, "I'm observing that she learned faster than he did." Renee laughed. Vivienne laughed too. Gerald Caldwell lives, as of this telling, alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in a suburb of Charlotte. His consulting business continues to operate. His client list is smaller than it was at its peak. He has, for the first time in his adult life, his name on every document that relates to his life. Every lease, every utility, every insurance policy, every account. He signs everything now. People who know him say he has become meticulous about paperwork. They say this as though it is a new quality he developed. It is not a new quality. It is a skill he always had access to. He just never had to use it before. Now let us talk about what happened in Asheville. Because this is not a story that ends with a filing cabinet and a certified letter and a settlement. This is a story about what a woman builds when she finally builds something only for herself. The house in Asheville sits on a quarter-acre lot on the western slope of a quiet street that dead ends at a trail leading up into the woods. The front porch faces west, which means that on a clear evening you can sit there and watch the light change across the mountain ridgeline for 45 minutes before it finally goes dark. Vivienne has sat on that porch every clear evening since she moved in. She bought a chair, one chair for herself, and she set it facing west, and she has not moved it since. She painted the porch a color called still water. It is a particular shade of blue that is not dramatic. It is simply the color of a morning that has not yet been disturbed by anything. She has not painted it white. She will not paint it white. She planted a vegetable garden in the backyard the spring she arrived. She knew almost nothing about gardening. She bought 3 books and read them all before she planted the first seed. The garden, by the second summer, was producing more tomatoes and green beans and summer squash than she could eat alone. She started bringing surplus to the Saturday farmers market and trading it for honey and bread from the vendors whose products she liked. She got a cat. He is an orange tabby named Howard, which is not after her attorney, but which her attorney found very funny when she told him. Howard the cat sits in the front window every morning and watches the street with the focused, comprehensive attention of someone who takes his responsibilities seriously. Vivienne finds this relatable. She began volunteering at a financial literacy program in Asheville approximately 8 months after moving there. The program served women who were rebuilding after divorce, women who had come out of marriages, sometimes long ones, with a compromised understanding of their own financial situation. Women who had trusted their husbands to handle things. Women who had signed where directed without reading what they were signing. Women who discovered, in the aftermath of a marriage ending, that they did not know what accounts existed in their names, what property they were entitled to, what their credit score was, or whether they had a retirement fund that belonged to them and not the marriage. Women who had, in short, done what Vivienne had done. Except that Vivienne had done it with clear eyes and a filing cabinet. These women had not always had the same clarity. Vivienne taught a class on Saturday mornings. She covered property law basics. She covered account structures. She covered the difference between being a co-signer and a co-owner. She covered what it meant to have your name on a deed versus simply living in the house on it. She covered the things her mother had taught her without knowing she was teaching them. The things she had learned at a kitchen table in Raleigh with a yellow legal pad and a garage sale calculator. She told no one in that class that she had lived the story she was teaching from. She didn't need to. The women in that class recognized something in the way she taught. The way you recognize someone who has been somewhere when they describe the route. Marcus Caldwell, who had grown up watching his mother manage everything and his father receive credit for most of it, came home from Atlanta the Thanksgiving after Vivienne moved to Asheville. He drove up on a Wednesday afternoon and found his mother in the kitchen making sweet potato pie from scratch and listening to Stevie Wonder at a volume that suggested she had not been expecting company quite so soon. He stood in the kitchen doorway. He said, "Mom, you look happy." She said, "I am happy." He said, "Like, actually happy. Not I'm fine happy." She set the bowl down and looked at her son. She said, "Yes, actually happy." He sat down at the kitchen table. He said, "I should have paid more attention to what was happening, to what you were dealing with." She said, "You were in college. You were supposed to be living your life." He said, "Still." She said, "Marcus, look at me." He looked at her. She said, "You're paying attention now. That's what matters." He nodded. They finished making the pie together. He ate 3 pieces. He drove back to Atlanta on Sunday with a container of leftover filling and a jar of honey she had traded tomatoes for at the farmer's market. He calls every Sunday now. He has not missed one yet. There is something this story asks of every person who hears it. And it is not the obvious thing. The obvious thing is outrage. And the outrage is earned. What Gerald Caldwell did, the deception, the dismissal, the brazenness of walking another woman into his wife's home, deserves the outrage it provokes. But the thing this story asks goes deeper than outrage. It asks you to think about what Vivienne was doing in all those years before any of this happened. She was not a passive woman. She was not a woman who was simply waiting for her husband to take care of things. She was the one doing the taking care. She was managing every account, filing every document, maintaining every record. She was, in the most literal financial sense, the infrastructure of the life they shared. And yet, in the social world they moved in the world of family dinners and neighborhood parties and Sunday church and holiday gatherings, it was Gerald who was credited with the life. Gerald who talked about their house. Gerald who described their neighborhood. Gerald who referred to the property and the business and the assets as ours, in a tone that carried the weight of mine. And Vivienne let it happen. Not because she was weak. Not because she was unaware. But because she was from a generation that was taught, in ways both spoken and unspoken, that a woman who outpaces her husband must do so quietly. That a woman who is more capable than the man beside her must make room for the man to feel capable too. That the management of a man's ego is part of the management of a household. Vivienne had been managing both for 22 years. The cost of that arrangement is not visible in any document in any filing cabinet. It is visible only in the 14 months of a separation that happened inside her own home. It is visible only in the moment Gerald looked at the floor. It is visible in the Saturday morning phone call from his mother. It is visible in the text from Bet about the apartment complex. It is visible in the particular kind of silence that falls when a woman who has built everything is treated as though she is standing in someone else's house. That silence is the real story here. Not the deed. Not the certified letter. Not the 30-day notice. The silence and then, finally, the end of it. Vivienne Caldwell is 61 years old. She sits on a blue porch in the mountains on clear evenings and watches the light change over the ridge. She grows tomatoes she can't use all of by herself and trades the excess for things made by other people's hands. She teaches on Saturday mornings to rooms full of women who are learning what they should have been told a long time ago. She has not spoken to Gerald Caldwell since the morning she last saw him in the hallway of her house on Haverford Lane. She does not carry the bitterness you might expect. Not because she has forgiven everything. Not because the wound was not real. But because bitterness requires you to keep holding something that belongs to someone else. Vivienne Caldwell has spent her whole life being careful about what she puts her name on. She is not about to put her name on anyone's grief but her own. She told her class of women one Saturday morning that the most important sentence she ever learned came from her mother at a kitchen table in Raleigh, North Carolina, before she was old enough to fully understand it. Her mother had said, "Money is language, and if you don't learn to speak it fluently, someone else will always translate for you." One of the women in the class asked, "What does that mean in practice?" Vivienne said, "It means read what you sign what you read, know what is in your name, know what you own, know the number in every account that belongs to you, know your credit score, know your deed, know your rights." She said, "And if anyone ever tells you that you are not capable of understanding these things, or that someone else will handle it, that is the moment to pay the most careful attention of your life." The room was quiet. Then the woman who had asked the question said, "I wish someone had told me that 20 years ago." Vivienne said, "I know. Me too." She smiled. She said, "But you're here now, so let's get to work." And so we come to the end of this story. Or rather, we come to the place where this story stops being a story and starts being a question. A question we want to leave with every person watching this tonight. Because there are women right now, sitting in living rooms, sitting in kitchens, sitting in bedrooms in houses they may or may not know are in their names, who are managing everything, who are filing everything, who are making the numbers work every month with a precision that no one around them fully sees, who are protecting someone else's dignity at the cost of their own clarity, and who have not yet opened the bottom drawer and counted what is theirs. Vivienne Caldwell's story did not begin with a betrayal. It began with a 12-year-old girl at a kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a 75-cent calculator. It ended, if it ended, on a blue porch on a mountain in Asheville with a cat in the window and a garden in the back and a phone call from her son every Sunday without fail. Everything in between was preparation. She just didn't know what she was preparing for. Now she does. And now so do you. We want to know what you thought of Vivienne's story. Tell us in the comments what the moment was, the exact moment when you felt it shift. Was it the kitchen when she set down the spoon? Was it the certified letter? Was it the porch when Raymond came with his careful voice and his family consensus? Was it the blue paint? Tell us. And here is the question we want to leave you with tonight. If Vivienne had never opened that bottom drawer, if she had never maintained those files, never kept those records, never made the calls she made, what would this story have looked like? What do you think she would have done? What would you have done? If the story moved you, if it stayed with you, if it made you think about someone you know or something you have been carrying, share it, because someone in your circle needs to hear this tonight. And if you are new here, welcome. We tell these stories every week. Stories about women who were underestimated. Stories about women who were counted out and counted back in. Stories about what happens when the person everyone overlooked turns out to have been paying attention to everything all along. Subscribe so you never miss one, because the next story is already waiting for you. And if you thought Vivienne's story was extraordinary, wait until you hear my next story. We will see you there.